Thank you all. It's a great tribute to Professor Gadgil that on a rainy day during a 3-day weekend, so many of you have come. But he was that kind of extraordinary figure. And to celebrate his life and legacy, we have here five remarkable individuals, distinguished scholars, writers, professionals in their own right. All of them knew Madhav Gadgil well, but at different phases of his life and in different contexts. So they will speak from their own distinctive disciplinary or professional perspective because Madhav spanned so many fields that one had to have an absolutely diverse panel. One couldn't have only five scientists or only five grassroots activists. So we are really privileged here today to have these five speakers. And we'll start with two scientists, Professor Uma Ramakrishnan of NCBS and Professor Harini Nagendra of Azim Premji University. Then we'll move to three who are not scientists, because Madhav Gadgil was, of course, a scientist, highly pedigreed scientist with a PhD from Harvard and taught at Harvard and wrote some classic pioneering papers in science. But as many of you know, he was that rare scientist who reached out to his fellow citizens through his work, through his scholarship, through his democratic instincts, through his restless field work. There was almost no part of India which he had not done, traversed through on foot, not through his smartphone or Instagram. And so, to show this diversity of his work, we have two scientists, which is appropriate to begin. Then we have Dr. Gurudas Nulkar from the Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics in Pune. And we start with him among the humanists because Maharashtra was the state in which Professor Gadgil was born, raised, and where he spent his last years. Then we move to Nagesh Hegde, pioneering, celebrated Kannada environmental journalist. And we come to him next because Karnataka was really, with apologies to the Maharashtrians in this room, his proper home state. And where, of course, he was deeply loved and cherished, and where he had done so much remarkable and pioneering work. And we end with Dr. John Kurian, who was for many years a professor at the Center for Development Economics and Development Studies in Trivandrum. And of course, Kerala was the state in which, towards the last years of his life, Madhav was best known, where his work was most widely celebrated. When he died, the Malayalam newspapers had pages and pages of tributes to him. A state that was not his home state, where, unlike Karnataka, he did not speak the language, and the state that is farthest away from Delhi. You know, in the so-called national newspapers in Delhi, I didn't notice what they would have said, but when a great intellectual and democrat dies, usually it will be the Prime Minister said this, and so on and so forth. So we'll end with Kerala, and to close off, I may, if you permit, offer a few recollections from my own association with Professor Gadgil, which spanned more than 4 decades of my life. So I will not do any further introductions. So they'll come up one by one in the order of Uma, Harini, Gurudas, Nagesh, and John. So Uma, you.
Hi, everyone, and so great to see a packed hall. I'm Uma, and I'm also a scientist. And I think, the first question which kind of comes to mind is, I think Professor Gadgil was, a true scientist. And we all wonder, what is a scientist? So, the definition is someone who actually collects data, investigates things, does research, tests hypotheses. It all sounds very boring, right? It sounds really dry. And it doesn't really seem like there's any place for passion or conviction or sense of purpose in science. Anyway, so Professor Gadgil started his scientific journey. And like all scientists, the PhD is a training ground where you really learn how you do science, how do you think about things, and so on. And Professor Gadgil was at Harvard at a time which was really exciting. the field of natural history and the exploration of nature by writing down things about what you see in nature was kind of morphing over the 60s into a much more quantitative discipline of ecology, where several authors talked about why species live in specific locations and how do populations grow and all of these things, but they talked about them quantitatively. So when you think of nature, you think, oh, it's so pretty and beautiful. How do you quantify it, right? But science requires this kind of quantification, prediction, understanding patterns through equations. And for his PhD, he worked on this really fundamental aspect of ecology called life history trade-offs. So basically, any animal has its life ahead of it, and it has energy to partition into reproduction or survival. And it could reproduce and have lots of offspring, but then it puts in so much energy into reproduction that it has less energy left for survival. And so its survival probability goes down, right? So of course, obviously, there are then trade-offs between reproducing or surviving. You could survive and reproduce a little bit later. And in collaboration with a mathematician, he talked about these trade-offs through cost and profit functions and predicted life history strategies. And there are indeed animals that reproduce extensively, boom and bust reproduction, and then just die, or they live long, slow lives and reproduce a little bit every year. And so he was able to predict these types of life histories based on these equations or trade-offs. Trade-offs were talked about, but quantifying them and how specific functions of these trade-offs can actually affect fitness and natural selection was something which wasn't discussed. And to this day, this paper is very widely cited. So as scientists, we look at the value of a piece of work by how many others have read it, referred to it, and that propagates the work into the future. Its magnitude, it grows that way. And so this work is, for example, cited over 2,000 times, published in 1972. He did other seminal work as part of his PhD, mostly theoretical, understanding things like dispersal, and also he tested the predictions of this trade-off paper in some plants in the Harvard field station, which is really interesting to see that, make predictions and test them with data from natural populations. So that was nice, and it would have been fine to kind of rest on these laurels. He came back and soon after a short stint in Pune was working in the Indian Institute of Science. But then he did what I hope scientists should do. He changed his mind about what his research interests were, and he became very curious about many things, including, you will hear from Harini, human ecology, understanding relationships between people and their environment, thinking about very interesting concepts like sacred groves, really delving deep into relationships that humans have with their environment. And of course, humans are part of our environment, and ecology is about interactions, whether they be humans with their environment or animals with each other. And so he thought, why not, this is my interpretation, by the way, he thought, why not address all of these issues also with the lens of science? And he was a very radical thinker in that many things he thought of, the idea of, things like sacred groves, people's relationship with nature, the carbon sequestration properties of forests. These are all hot topics today, but he worked on these and published on these in the 80s and the 90s. So I think he was a scientist, and what was amazing was, not just that he was a scientist who collected evidence and collected data and suggested evidence, but also that his science was defined by passion and a sense of purpose. And he was disruptive in that he just went on with new and wonderful ideas, which were definitely disruptive at the time. So personally, I was very lucky to have met him when I was a teenager, because his daughter was my classmate in school. And I remember many fun ecology lectures in their bedroom because they had a nice blackboard in their bedroom. And I remember him really talking about how ecology works. And I was, of course, bitten by the ecology bug at that time. I spent a lot of time in the Western Ghats with his early students, Ranjit Daniels and others. And I think what I'll remember the most is that he always gave me the most radical suggestions. Once he said to me, "Why don't you take a year off and learn scuba diving?" And it was at the age of 17. That sounded really radical. Remember, I'm 52, so I grew up a long time ago. And I think that, to me, that typifies his approach. He was very, very enabling of people. And he really never thought that, he at least I got the feeling from him that I could do anything. I could study math and do ecology. I could study something else and do something else. And I'm really grateful for having that my life intersected with his. And he's really someone whom we will miss. Thank you.
Thanks, Uma. I'm just going to begin and end with two pieces from his wonderful book that I hope everyone has read. If you haven't, it's A Walk Up the Hill. It's his autobiography. And I'll talk about the man, but I'm sort of starting here to give you a flavor of the kind of person that he was. So he wrote, when I was doing my PhD with him from 93 to 98, this column towards the end of this, which he started in the Hindu, using nonsense rhymes to start introducing ecology. And this one was after an oil tanker that had a leak off the Konkan coast. And it starts with a limerick. He used to write these limericks himself and enjoyed them very much. A thoughtful old shark of Murud felt it was awfully rude that a tanker full of oil should suddenly go on boil and spew out a quantity of crude. Right? And from there, he went on to talk about crude oil and oil tankers and the damage to marine life. But you see the hook. Here was an ecologist who did something that very few ecologists, I think, or very few scientists have done before or after. I mean, there are exceptions. I see, Professor Nanjudia sitting in the audience. There are a few scientists and have always been in India who take science beyond the classroom, beyond the laboratory and into public view. But very, very few. And given the fact that ecology and conservation are so intertwined with society, it's surprising that there aren't more people like this. But I think Madhav Gadgil was a giant, a colossus who came and went, right? I'll tell you how I first met him, since Uma shared a story. So I was an integrated PhD student, the first batch of 3 students who had come in to do a master's and a PhD. And most of us were doing all 3 of us were doing some form of biology, cell biology, molecular biology. I myself had an undergraduate degree in microbiology. And then I found I absolutely hated being in the lab. I'd go in at 6 a.m. and come out at 12 at night, and it was dark, and I was planning to leave. And the Center for Ecological Sciences, which Professor Gadgil had set up then, had its 10th year anniversary. And there was a very well-known evolutionary biologist, Hutchinson, who was supposed to speak, but they were off schedule, and I heard Madhav speak. And I didn't know he was famous. I didn't know anything. I didn't come to ecology in the standard routes. I wasn't a naturalist. I wasn't a bird watcher. I wasn't someone who came to ecology, but I absolutely was captivated by what he said. He said, we must do low-cost science, we must do science in our backyard, and we must do science that speaks to India's conditions. And all of these were things that I was thinking about. So not knowing who he was, of his fame, of the fact that he regularly had people coming to him like this, I went with the sort of, I would call it the arrogance and ignorance of youth. And I must have been 21 then. And said, I heard you talk. I thought what you said was interesting. I'd like to work with you. But I'm not sure if I want to continue for a PhD. So I'll try it out for some time and see how it goes. And I mean, I would say it's a tribute to the greatness of the man that he immediately smiled and said, come in, let's try and figure out what you could do. And we evolved a program along the way of using satellite images and remote sensing to map the Western Ghats. And I'll give you a sense of the diversity, the sheer diversity of what he looked at. One of his students, Srinivas Singh, looked at wild relatives of cultivated plants because he came from a farming background and was very interested in understanding how cultivated plants were related to their original wild relatives. What was the genetic diversity? What was the ecological diversity? Then there was Hansraj Negi, who passed away, unfortunately, a few years after his PhD. But Negi came from the hills of the Himalayas, and he was looking at lichen. in the Greater Himalayan National Park, which is this grand, magnificent park with mountains and peaks. He was looking at ants and lichen, the most tiny, but yet the most important of ecosystems, right? And then there was Prabhakar, who finished his PhD before me, looking at ecological history of the Nilgiris. So this was the kind of man, each of his PhD students did something completely different. His own wife, Sulochana, he collaborated with her a lot, was a very, very well-known trailblazing woman of her times because she was an atmospheric scientist, did extremely quantitative work, and as he often said, would help advise him every time, he needed some mathematical inputs. Of course, he himself was a very well-known mathematical ecologist also. And the kind of things from mathematical and theoretical ecology all the way to field practice, that range, I can't think of anyone else who has done this. When I was doing my PhD with him, he had just won the Pew Award and used that money instead of furthering his own lab and his own research. He said, what are we missing in India today? And that was a time in the 90s where undergraduate BSc Zoology, BSc Botany programs were closing up across the country, because there was no job market, there was no demand, people didn't see them as fashionable areas. And what he did was set up the Western Ghats Biodiversity Network, which gave grants to college teachers across the length and breadth of the Western Ghats to do basic biology, botany, zoology work, and to get trained with, data sets, identification kits, and put all of this together for mapping the Western Ghats. He then worked with a number of people across the Ghats to set up the People's Biodiversity Registers, which was with the idea that science cannot be the domain only of scientists alone, as Uma also alluded to, that you must have village communities who are extremely knowledgeable about their own biodiversity, far more knowledgeable than we as outside scientists can, I think, ever expect to be. They have to document not just their biodiversity, but the uses of their biodiversity, the heritage, the culture, and everything else associated with the biodiversity. So he set up the People's Biodiversity Registers, set up 65, 70 different samples across the country. And now this is something that every village, every region is mandated to do. Of course, as he talks about in the book, it's often a travesty because you sometimes have consultants coming in to create PBRs, but that's not what his vision was. He was, at the same time that he was working on People's Biodiversity Registers and working with college teachers across Karnataka and school students and college students, he was also the chairman of the Global Environment Fund STAP, the Scientific, Technical and Advisory Panel, in charge of bringing out Global Biodiversity Outlook book, which is this massive volume which does international biodiversity, sort of a register of international biodiversity. Again, the range of the man, right? That international, chairing the STAP, I think before and after, there has never been any Indian scientist of that stature to chair the STAP, right? And won the Tyler Prize, won so many influential prizes. But at the last, his heart was always in the ecology. And one of my last messages from him talked about working with his son, Siddharth, to set up an AI-based translation to take basic knowledge in ecology, biodiversity, and the environment into Marathi and then into other Indian languages. And also, I think the book is a lot of the work of Gauri, who's sitting in the audience, trying, working with her father, trying to get very rich life into a narration that people can sort of put together in the form of one book. I think there would actually be something like 20 volumes if you left it. So this is the part that I'll end us with to give us again a flavor of the man himself. He had an acerbic wit, a very dry humor, and a very pungent humor, I'll say, often aimed either at himself or at people that he had a moral difference of opinion with. For him, science was deeply, deeply moral. And so I'll end with this very, very interesting story where he talks about a time that he went with a group of people, including field assistants, for a walk in the hills, and he wanted to go up for a walk in the evening, and they tried to dissuade him. And he said, "No, I'll be back before night." But the mist fell, and he couldn't come back to the place where they were staying. And so he climbed a tree, and he was very good at tree climbing and maintained his agility because, as he said, again with his characteristic wit, at the Indian Institute of Science, he used to make field assistants climb a tree, a gulmohar tree in the parking lot as an example, and enjoy the fact that others around him were looking and seeing, the sight, unaccustomed sight of seeing an Indian Institute of Science professor climbing trees in the parking lot. Right? So he climbed this tree, he spent the night, and next day morning, he wove his way through the forest coming back. And of course, his guide was very worried because he had lost the famous professor and would obviously be worried. So he says, "When I quietly entered the bungalow, I was received by the occupants with tremendous relief and delight. Prasad and the guide had reached there a couple of hours before me with little hope of ever seeing me alive again. So, preparations were afoot to organize a search party. The guide would have been blamed for the disaster. So, when he beheld me, he ran up and gave me a tight hug, as no man had ever done before or has done since. And I'll end with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was a nice anecdote, and I had the privilege of reading his initial book, which he had written, "The Walk Up the Hill." It wasn't called the Walk Up the Hill. You know, he first wrote it in Marathi, and the Marathi name is Sahyachala Ek Prem Kahani. So Sahyadri, a love story, and it was all about love. But somehow the publisher didn't want that name, and therefore it ended up as a Walk Up the Hill. Just to add to what Harini said about climbing trees, he was a phenomenal athlete during his college days. You know, he did the high jump and hop, step and jump and a couple of other athletic things, and he always liked to tell me about that. His initial bachelor's degree was in Ferguson College, and I had the privilege of, when he was invited to do a podcast for the Rohini Nilekani Foundation Grassroots Nations podcast. And they asked him who should interview you. He said, okay, Gurudas should interview me. And that was a phenomenal privilege that I had. And I had a couple of rounds with him initially before I did those interviews to understand what all went. And I really saw the man behind the image, exactly what the story describes. And then he was so effervescent when he used to say his stories about athletics and his field trips with Iravati Karve. Iravati Karve, the famous anthropologist who was working at that time in Pune University, lived next door to them. And she used to frequently go on field trips, and he loved to be on those field trips. His father, Dhananjay Rao Gadgil, allowed him to skip school at that time, because he said that learning is not going to come only from the classroom. It's already also going to come from outside the classroom, and being and going around with Iravati Karve. Irukaku is what he used to call him, right? I mean, it's also written in the book. He went ahead with those, and those were the formative years. He also narrated a story in that podcast about this little kid, little Madhav. You know, he identified birds even before he could read. And he used Salim Ali's field guide for that purpose. So one day he said that, I saw a little green bee eater without its characteristic pin tail. And he thought he had discovered a new species. And he wrote a postcard to Salim Ali. And in his characteristic style, Salim Ali replied, and he explained the molting phenomena. And, it disheartened him that it was not a new species. But I got to meet Madhav Gadgil very late in my life as well as his life. In fact, when he came back home to Pune, and after that, I got to meet him. I first met Professor Gadgil through his books. First through this Fissured Land, which he has co-authored with Ram Guha, and then through Ecology and Equity. And both the books had a deep impression on my mind, and I always wanted to meet him. My friend from West Bengal and Odisha, Debal Deb, some of you probably might know him. So Debalda is a good friend, and Debalda, when he was going to come to visit me, he says, I want to make a trip to Madhav Gadgil's home, because he was a student. And then we went together, and that was my first meeting in person with him. I was not a student in the academic setting. I was always a student, but not in buildings. Out of the buildings. So that's, and I presented my book, which was titled, really brazenly titled, I thought, that Ecology, Equity and the Economy. So it was an extension of that. And I half expected him to read, but immediately a couple of days later, he gave me a call saying, Gurudas, तुम्ही काय करताय सध्या? I mean, we used to converse in Marathi all the time. So I said, I'm working on this Meena Nadi restoration project. And of course, he knew about Meena Nadi because it originated in the Western Ghats around Bhima Shankar, which is to the north of Pune city. And it was an area which had the highest incidence of cancer. And we were trying to work on that river restoration as well as some kind of farming stuff like that. And he said, तुम्ही भेटायला या मला, you come and meet me. So immediately, I mean, it was a chance that I just simply could not miss. And then from then on, I think our meetings as well as telephonic conversations went on for hours together. And we used to, even during COVID times, we used to have discussions for over an hour on the phone. And he was a guiding light for a lot of my projects, as well as very latest projects also. He worked upon that. But to Meena Nadi, this happened, I think, when he was about 74, 75 years of age. And then he came with me to Meena Nadi, and he brought a few of his tribals from Gadchiroli, because he was very deeply involved with the project in Gadchiroli. And he said, you invite them over. We called them over. Vijay Idlabadkar, one of the professors there, we called them from Gadchiroli, which is a godforsaken place, which is far away from Nagpur. They came all the way here to Narayan Gaon, which is where the Meena Nadi descends after it originates from the Western Ghats. And there he himself took sessions about how to write the People's Biodiversity Register, what's wrong with the way that you guys are working. And, the entire restoration program, he kind of was advising on how to go about it. And the Sarpanch, very surprisingly, was deeply involved after Professor Gadgil came in there. So all these people, they used to gather and sit around, and he came with us at least about 2 or 3 times, if I'm not mistaken, there in Meena Nadi. But every other project, he kind of always was there to guide us. One of the projects one day I got a call from him saying, Gurudas, in your book you have written about the 5 capitals, the natural capital, social capital, human capital, produce capital, and financial capital. And there is recently that Nisarga cyclone had taken place in that was the severest cyclone which hit the western coast of India. In the landfall was in Raigad district. And so he says, why don't you do an assessment? By that time, there were newspapers which were flooding with the reports of financial losses due to Nisarga cyclone and things like that. He says, why don't you do an assessment in this 5 capital framework? I said, that's a brilliant idea. Let's just put it into test. And then he guided us on that. We collected all these tribal people who were living in Raigad and also around Ratnagiri, not the tribals in Ratnagiri, but the other local communities. And we studied the 5 capitals. And he says, you give a precedence to qualitative studies rather than quantitative, because you can't measure social capital on quantitative basis. But there were several things which we stumbled upon. One of the things which we saw, and this was also something which he asked us to see, jobs were lost after the Nisarga cyclone, and it was a severe disaster. There were horticultural yards of mango and supari trees which vanished. One of the losses in social capital which we found was that the domestic violence severely increased after that thing. And this is what came up in the questions he said you need to ask. So we stumbled upon many things which were based upon what his advice was to us upon that. Coming to think of it, what did we learn? What did I learn from him? I think the fundamental lesson that I got is that conservation is intricately and deeply connected to the principles of democracy and social justice. That is my single understanding of how sustainable development should progress. I mean, if Gandhi's concept of Antyodaya was to be operationalized, this was it. He actually said that without social justice, without democratic principles, without participation, you cannot get onto conservation. And I think I just want to end with one incident which it was deeply engraved in his mind. At a very young age, his father, Dhananjay Rao Gadgil, who was also the founding director of where I come from, Gokhale Institute, he was assigned the task of doing an economic impact assessment of the Koyna Dam. Koyna is one of the largest dams Maharashtra has. And he saw large-scale deforestation and livelihoods of peoples in the West. This was in Western Ghats, of people in the Western Ghats who were displaced horribly and were not given compensation because of the dam. And the dam was going to fundamentally change the way Mumbai received its electricity. So it was like it was a grand solution for Mumbai's electricity demand. And his father, Dhananjay Rao Gadgil, came home and said, this is not the development which we want. And when little Madhav asked him what's wrong with it, he said, this is development by exclusion. This is not the kind of development which is going to please all. So Sarvodaya, the concept of Sarvodaya, Antyodaya is one part where you unto this last, but Sarvodaya is, upliftment of everybody. It just cannot happen that you can supply electricity to Mumbai by displacing tribals and uprooting them and putting them out of their context and things like that. So this is what he was deeply impressed upon his young mind, and probably that incident led to his thing. his last visit was to my house on the 4th of December. He was supposed to be paneling a discussion with Kailash Malhotra, who is also a very good friend of mine. Unfortunately, Casey, as he is very fondly known, Casey could not come to Pune because of Indigo's goof up that time. So I had invited both of them for dinner. So only Professor Gadgil came, and then my mother is from Sirsi, so he has a very deep connection with Sirsi, and he's been there for quite some time. So I said, okay, we'll make Bishibari Anna, and then me eto. So after the Vanarai discussion, which went on till about 6:37, then he came home, and we had a great chat. He was there in my house till about 11 o'clock. And my last meeting with him was about 24 hours before he passed away in his bed. And even at that time, I could see the bright light in his eyes whenever he was talking about something. So he also told me with Harini, he told me to convene a team to use AI, and he was telling me about how Siddharth was also helping him to understand what tools to use and all that. So we are still on it. We are going to do it in PIC, which is the Pune equivalent of BIC. So so that's about my last connection with him, about 24 hours before he died. So Madhav Gadgil is probably doing his last walk up his hill. Thank you, Professor Gadgil. Thank you so much.
ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ಗಾಡ್ಗಿಲ್ ಅವರ ಗೌರವಾರ್ಥ ನಾನು ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲೇ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತೀನಿ. ದೇರ್ ಆರ್ 2 ರೀಸನ್ಸ್ ಫಾರ್ ಇಟ್. ಮೊದಲನೇದಾಗಿ, ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಅವರ ಕರ್ಮಭೂಮಿಯಾಗಿತ್ತು. ಈಚ್ ಟೈಮ್ ಐ ರ್ಯಾಂಗ್ ಹಿಮ್ ಅಪ್, ಹಲೋ ಹೇಗಿದ್ದೀರಿ ನಾಗೇಶ್ ಅವರೇ, ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿದ್ದೀರಾ, ಯೂಸ್ ಟು. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಹಿಸ್ ಕನ್ನಡ ವಾಸ್ ನಾಟ್ ಎ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರು ಕನ್ನಡ, ಇಟ್ ವಾಸ್ ಸಿರ್ಸಿ ಕನ್ನಡ, ಉತ್ತರ ಕನ್ನಡ. He went there and he acquired that local accent and he retained it till last December. ಆಗಲೂ ಕೂಡ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಆ ಕನ್ನಡನೇ ಗೊತ್ತಿತ್ತು. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಅವರು ಅಲ್ಲಿದ್ದಾಗ, ಆಫ್ಟರ್ ರಿಟೈರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಈ ವೆಂಟ್ ಬ್ಯಾಕ್ ಟು ಪುಣೆ. ಕಳೆದ 2 ವರ್ಷದಲ್ಲಿ he constituted a WhatsApp group of people interested in his works or in ecology and environment. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಅವರು ಕನ್ನಡಿಗ ಅಂತ ಹೆಸರು ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ರು. So the moment I get a notification Kannadiga, it has to be either Madhav Gadgil or his friends here. ಎರಡನೇ ಕಾರಣ, ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡೋದು ಯಾಕೆಂದರೆ ಸಿರ್ಸಿ ವಾಸ್ ಹಿಸ್ ಫಲ್ಕ್ರಮ್ಸ್, ದಟ್ ವಾಸ್ ಹಿಸ್ ನೇಸೆಂಟ್. ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಬಂದಾಗ ಅವರು ಸಿರ್ಸಿಯಲ್ಲೇ ಅವರು ತಮ್ಮ ಕಾರ್ಯಾಚರಣೆಯನ್ನು ಮೂಲತಃ ಆರಂಭ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದು, ಅಲ್ಲೆಲ್ಲ ಓಡಾಡಿದರು. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಎ ವೆರಿ ಇಂಟ್ರೆಸ್ಟಿಂಗ್ ಥಿಂಗ್ ಹ್ಯಾಪನ್ಡ್ in 1980s. Professor Madhav Gadgil had come in 73 or so. But in 1980, Amulya Reddy came from Princeton, S.R. Hiramat came from Chicago, Kusuma Saurabh came from Mumbai, Pandurang Hegde came from Delhi, Nagesh Hegde came from Nainital. They all came here. And Vandana Shiva was here. And because Shivaram Karan started writing about ecology and environment, ತೇಜಸ್ವಿ ಅವರು ಕೂಡ ಅದೇ ಟೈಮ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಪರಿಸರದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಬರೆಯೋಕ್ಕೆ ಶುರು ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು. ಆಲ್ ಆಫ್ ದೆಮ್ ಹ್ಯಾಡ್ ಎ ಲಿಂಕ್ ವಿತ್ ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ ಮಾಧವ್ ಗಾಡ್ಗಿಲ್. ಎಷ್ಟು ಇಂಟ್ರೆಸ್ಟಿಂಗ್ ಇತ್ತು ಅಂದರೆ, H.S. ದೊರೆಸ್ವಾಮಿ ಯೂಸ್ ಟು ಕಾಲ್, ನಾಗೇಶ್ ಒಂದು ಮೀಟಿಂಗ್ ಮಾಡ್ಬಿಡೋಣ ಅಂದರೆ, ಫಸ್ಟ್ ನೇಮ್ ಯೂಸ್ ಟು ಮಾಧವ್ ಗಾಡ್ಗಿಲ್, ಆಮೇಲೆ ವಂದನಾ ಶಿವ, ಆಮೇಲೆ ನಾಗೇಶ್ ಹೆಗಡೆ, ಪಾಂಡುರಂಗ ಹೆಗಡೆ, ಇತ್ಯಾದಿ. ಇವನ್ ನಂಜುಂಡಸ್ವಾಮಿ ಆಲ್ಸೋ. ಸೊ ಇಂಟ್ರೆಸ್ಟಿಂಗ್. ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲೇ ಕನ್ವರ್ಸೇಷನ್ ಆಗ್ತಾಯಿತ್ತು. ಅವರಿಗೆ ಅಮಂಗ್ ದಿಸ್ ಗ್ರೂಪ್, 1980 ಗ್ರೂಪ್, 4 of us were from ಉತ್ತರ ಕನ್ನಡ. ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಇಸ್ ದಿ ಲಾರ್ಜೆಸ್ಟ್ ನಂಬರ್ ಆಫ್ ಎನ್ವೈರ್ಮೆಂಟಲ್ ಮೂವ್ಮೆಂಟ್ಸ್, ಚಳವಳಿಗಳು, ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಮೋಸ್ಟ್ ಡೈವರ್ಸ್ ಚಳವಳಿ. ಅವೆಲ್ಲವೂ ಕೂಡ ಉತ್ತರ ಕನ್ನಡ ಜಿಲ್ಲೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಆಗಿದ್ದು. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ದೆರ್ ವಾಸ್ ಎ ಡೆವಲಪ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಮ್ಯಾರಥಾನ್ ಆಗ್ತಾಯಿತ್ತು. ಕಾಳಿ ನದಿ ಡ್ಯಾಮ್ ಕಟ್ಟಿದ್ರು, ಬೇಡ್ತಿ ನದಿ ಡ್ಯಾಮ್ ಕಟ್ಟಿದ್ರು, ಕೈಗಾ ಅಲ್ಲೇ ಬರ್ತಾಯಿತ್ತು, ನೆವಲ್ ಬೇಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲೇ ಬರ್ತಾಯಿತ್ತು, ಬಿಸ್ಗೋಡ್ ಮ್ಯಾಂಗನೀಸ್ ಮೈನಿಂಗ್ ಆಗ್ತಾಯಿತ್ತು. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ದ್ಯಾಟ್ ಹ್ಯಾಪನ್ ಟು ಅಟ್ರಾಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಧವ್ ಟು ದ್ಯಾಟ್. ಹಿ ವೆಂಟ್ ಅರೌಂಡ್. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡಿದ್ರೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹಳ್ಳಿಲಿ ಹೋಗಿ ಕೂತ್ಕೋತಾ ಇದ್ರು ಅಡಿಕೆ ತೋಟದವ್ರ ಜೊತೆಗೆ. ಬೆಳಗ್ಗೆ ಎದ್ದು ಬಿಸಿಲು ಕಾಯಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು ಹೋಟೆಲ್ ಎದುರಿಗೆ, ಲುಂಗಿ ಉಟ್ಕೊಂಡು, ಒಂದು ಬನಿಯನ್ನು ಹಾಕ್ಕೊಂಡು, ಒಂದು ಸಣ್ಣ ಚೀಲದಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ಶೇವಿಂಗ್ ಬ್ಲೇಡು ಅದು ಆಯ್ತು, ಸಣ್ಣ ಸೋಪ್ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ಓಪನ್ ಬಾತ್ರೂಮ್ ಅಲ್ಲೆಲ್ಲ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ಈಗ ಅಲ್ಲೇ ಶೇವ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೋತಾ ಇದ್ರು. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಅವ್ರ ಜೊತೆ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು. ಐ ಹ್ಯಾಡ್ ಡಿಫಿಕಲ್ಟ್ ಟೈಮ್ ಟು ಕನ್ವಿನ್ಸ್ ದಿ ವಿಲೇಜಸ್ ದಟ್ ಹೀ ಈಸ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಹಾರ್ವರ್ಡ್. ನಂಬಿಸೋಕೆ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇರಲಿಲ್ಲ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ, ಅಷ್ಟರ ಮಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಅವರು. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಈ ಅಕ್ವೈರ್ಡ್ ದಿ ಅಕ್ಸೆಂಟ್ ಆಫ್ ದಿ ಲೋಕಲ್ ಪೀಪಲ್. ಆದಮೇಲೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಮಂಚಿಕೇರಿಗೆ ಹೋದರು, ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಕುಮಟಾಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋದರು. ಕುಮಟಾದಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ಐಡೆಂಟಿಫೈಡ್ ಎ ಫಾರೆಸ್ಟ್ ವಿಚ್ ಈಸ್ ಮ್ಯಾನೇಜ್ಡ್ ಬೈ ಪೀಪಲ್. ಉತ್ತರ ಕನ್ನಡದವರಿಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಿರಲಿಲ್ಲ ಆ ಫಾರೆಸ್ಟ್ನ, ಹಳಕಾರ್ ಫಾರೆಸ್ಟ್ ಅಂತೇಳಿ. he located the history of that, and then he made it nationally famous, a forest managed by the people themselves. Incidentally, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ ಇದನ್ನು, ಕಳೆದ ವರ್ಷ ಆ ಫಾರೆಸ್ಟ್ಗೆ 100ನೇ ವರ್ಷ ಆಯಿತು. he was supposed to come, but he was physically so weak, but he donated 100,000 rupees for that forest from his pocket alone. It's an amazing thing. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಅವರಿಗೆ he organized a national seminar in Sirsi again on dams, major dams, a second look ಅಂಥೇಳಿ. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಪರಾಂಜಪೆ ಅವರು ಬಂದಿದ್ದರು, ಕೆ ಸಿ ಮಲ್ಹೋತ್ರ, ಅವ್ರ ಫ್ರೆಂಡ್ಸ್ ಯಾರು, ವಿಜಯ್ ಪರಾಂಜಪೆ and Malhotra, K.C. Malhotra. They came from Calcutta and Pune. Somebody from Delhi also came. That was a really truly national seminar on an issue which so far had not gained any attention from the public. The major dams. Major dams ಅಂದರೆ there are the temples of modern India ಅಂತ ನೆಹರು ಹೇಳಿದ್ದನು. That was questioned there first time. 100 ರೂಪಾಯಿ ನೀವು ಇನ್ವೆಸ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದರೆ what you get is only 70 paise. That was the statistician informed there. ಆ ಕಾನ್ಫರೆನ್ಸಿಗೆ ಶಿವರಾಮ್ ಕಾರಂತರ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರಾಗಿದ್ದರು. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ದಟ್ ಕೇಮ್ ಇನ್ ದಿ ಫಾರ್ಮ್ ಆಫ್ ಎ ಬುಕ್, ಮೇಜರ್ ಡ್ಯಾಮ್ಸ್ ಅಂತೇಳಿ. ದಟ್ ವಾಸ್ ದಿ ಇನಿಷಿಯಲ್ ಬಿಗಿನಿಂಗ್ ಆಫ್ ಎನ್ ಆರ್ಗನೈಸ್ಡ್ ಎನ್ವೈರ್ಮೆಂಟಲ್ ಇಂಟೆಲೆಕ್ಚುವಲ್ ಮೂವ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ದಟ್ ಇನ್ಸ್ಪೈರ್ಡ್, ಆಫ್ ಕೋರ್ಸ್, ನರ್ಮದಾ ಬಚಾವ್ ಆಂದೋಲನ್ ಆಲ್ಸೋ. ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ಸೊ ಎಲ್ಸ್ವೇರ್ ಆಲ್ಸೋ ಮೇಜರ್ ಡ್ಯಾಮ್ಸ್ started getting second look from the common people also and the intellectuals also. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಅದೆಲ್ಲ ಆದಮೇಲೆ then he inspired us all to take a marathon walk, ಪಶ್ಚಿಮ ಘಟ್ಟ ಚಲೋ, ಪಶ್ಚಿಮ ಘಟ್ಟ ಕಾಲ್ನಡಿಗೆಯಲ್ಲಿ 400 kilometers. He did not actually undertake. Shivram Karant was there. We were all there. But he, at the culmination of the 5-8 days walkathon, it held in Goa. ಅವರೇ ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರಾಗಿದ್ದರು. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಆಲ್ told us that ecology cannot be preserved by the people sitting in Delhi or Bengaluru. It has to be done only at the local people. ಅವ್ರನ್ನ ಅವೇರ್ನೆಸ್ ಅವರಲ್ಲಿ ಕ್ರಿಯೇಟ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾದ್ದು ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಮೋಸ್ಟ್ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಅಂತ. His speech on that conference was the original idea to set up this WGEEP, Western Ghats Environmental Ecology Panel. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಮಾಧವ್ ಗಾಡ್ಗಿಲ್ ಅವರು ಚೇರ್ಮನ್ ಆಗಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಯು ನೋ ಆಲ್ ದಟ್. ಆಫ್ಟರ್ ದ್ಯಾಟ್ he went back again to Sirsi. He had organized 3-4 ಸಂಸ್ಥೆಗಳನ್ನು ಕಟ್ಟಿದ್ರು. He was, Astra had come into existence in Bengaluru, that is to take technology to the rural people. That he implemented there in Sirsi. Sahyadri high school teachers and students ಸೇರಿಸ್ಕೊಂಡು he organized them. Totgar society ಸೇರಿಸ್ಕೊಂಡು he organized this national seminar. ಆ ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ, ಟೀಚರ್ಸಿಗೆ ಪ್ಲಸ್ ಕಾಲೇಜ್ ಸ್ಟೂಡೆಂಟ್ಸಿಗೆ he was teaching how to identify biological species, important species, keystone species, ಅದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ. That is when he was the chairperson of Global Environmental Facility. He would teach to the children of Pashchima Ghatta the importance of ecology. ಮಾಧವ್ ಗಾಡ್ಗಿಲ್ ಅಂದರೆ ನಮಗೆ 3 ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಇಶ್ಯೂ ನೆನಪಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಥಿಂಗ್ ಇಸ್ ದಟ್ he gave us the concept of iron triangle. ಭಾರತದ ಇಡೀ ಅಭಿವೃದ್ಧಿ ಈ ಒಂದು ಕಬ್ಬಿಣದ ತ್ರಿಕೋನದಲ್ಲಿರುತ್ತೆ. ಏನು ಅಂದರೆ ಅಧಿಕಾರಿಗಳು, ಗುತ್ತಿಗೆದಾರರು, ರಾಜಕಾರಣಿಗಳು, ಈ 3ರ ಕೈಯಲ್ಲಿ ಇಡೀ ಭಾರತದ ಪರಿಸರ ಸಂಪತ್ತು ಕೇಂದ್ರೀಕೃತ ಹಿಂಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ದಟ್ ವಾಸ್ ದಿ ವಾಟ್ ಹಿ ವಾಸ್ ಅಗೇನ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಅಗೇನ್ ಹಿ ವಾಸ್ ಟೆಲಿಂಗ್. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಹಿ with Ram Guha gave us a concept of identifying people on the basis of ecosystem. ಇಲ್ಲಿವರೆಗೆ ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ಸ್ ಅಂದರೆ ಅವರು ಇಂಥ ಜಾತಿಯವರು, ಇಂಥ ರಾಜಕಾರಣಕ್ಕೆ ಸೇರಿದವರು, ಇಂಥವರು ಹೇಳ್ಬೋದಿತ್ತು. ಬಟ್ ಹಿ ಗೇವ್ ಎ ಕ್ಲಾಸಿಫಿಕೇಶನ್. Ecosystem people, those who are totally dependent on the ecosystem, they don't depend upon the market system elsewhere. Secondly, those who have lost everything because of major developmental projects, they're ecological refugees. Third category, we all come omnivores. We gobble up from everything from anywhere from the anywhere of this planet. So these 3 categories, when I was teaching environmental journalism in Bangalore, I used to assign students, go to city market and identify 3 categories of these people. They would do that happily. They would go to Majestic and then identify, those ಅಲ್ಲೆಲ್ಲೋ ಸಣ್ಣ ಪುಟ್ಟ ಕಾಳುಗಳನ್ನು ಮಾರಾಟ ಮಾಡೋರು, ಜೇನು ರಟ್ಟನ್ನು ತಂದ್ಕೊಂಡು ಅದು ಮಾರಾಟ ಮಾಡೋರು, ದೇರ್ ಆಲ್ ಇಕೋಸಿಸ್ಟಮ್ ಪೀಪಲ್. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂಗಡಿಲಿ ಹೂಮಾಲ ಎಲ್ಲ ಮಾಡೋರು, slum dwellers, they are all ecological refugees. And those who come there in their car, jostle there to buy the best of the fruits and coconuts and all. They are the omnivores. So students used to enjoy that, classifying them, talking to them, identifying them and documenting them. That was very interesting. Third concept, again, with Ram Guha, Madhav Gadgil said, what is that? ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಪರಿಸರ ವಿಲೋಮಾನುಪಾತ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳೋದು. ಅವರು ಗಾಡ್ಗಿಲ್ ಗುಹಾ ಇನ್ವರ್ಸ್ ಪ್ರಿನ್ಸಿಪಲ್ ಅಂತೇಳಿ, ಏನಂದರೆ ಎನ್ ಇಲೆಕ್ಟೆಡ್ ರಿಪ್ರೆಸೆಂಟೇಟಿವ್ ಫ್ರಾಮ್ ಪಂಚಾಯತ್ ಲೆವೆಲ್ ಹ್ಯಾಸ್ ವೆರಿ ಗುಡ್ ಅಂಡರ್ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಡಿಂಗ್ ಆಫ್ ಲೇಕ್ಸ್, ರಿಸರ್ವಾಯರ್ಸ್, ನಾಲಾಸ್, ವಿಲೇಜ್ ಫಾರೆಸ್ಟ್, birds and all. He will have lot of respect for that. If he becomes slightly ZP member, his interest slowly reduces. If he becomes MLA, his interest will be further diluted at all. If the moment he becomes MP, he loses everything about all social things. You see, inverse relationship and all. That was very interesting. And coming to the last thing, he had that 360-degree vision of India. He was with the nomadic people, with the tribal people, with farmers, fishermen, with Brahmins of that area. And he would bring all that with Brahmins. He would talk about Sanskrit slokas. With the local people, Marathi, ಅಲ್ಲಿ nomads are. ಅವ್ರ ಜೊತೆಗೆ he would talk about Gatha Saptashati. It's a Marathi where bamboo is celebrated in 100 different slokas about importance. He would talk about basic legal aspects to the people of Sirsi. He knew statistics, he knew mathematics, he knew social system, he knew the entire Sanatana Dharma and traditions. He would collect information from the grassroots level people and he would report it to the upper echelons of the society. So that kind of a thing, I have not seen any other scientist. And as per his own kind of thesis, only ecosystem people can, the local grassroots level people can preserve environment. We are not capable of, we are not competent enough to preserve the environment of those areas. But what we can preserve is that Madhav Gadgil's legacy we should preserve. That those people cannot do that. His documents, his methodology of research, his research papers, and his columns, his autobiography, and his stories, that should be preserved. Thank you very much.
I wish I could speak so informally, but I can't. My dear friends of Madhav, and I'm sure it's a wide circle of admirers who have gathered here. And I consider it a singular honor to be able to speak here. This is the city where I was born and brought up. And to talk about such a towering personality is really someone who shaped the world of environmental science. When Ram Guha called me on the 8th of January morning to tell me about the sad news, I was strolling on the beach with my wife, and he asked me if I would speak about my relationship with Madhav, and more importantly, Madhav's relationship with Kerala. My first reaction was hesitation, because I thought there must be lots more persons in his inner circle who are much better suited to talk about Madhav's relationship to Kerala. Although I am Keralite, I've been in Kerala and all that, but there were lots more people who could speak with much greater authority and affection than I would be able to talk about his relationship with Kerala. But then thinking about it, about Madhav and the way he cultivated friendships, the next day on my morning walk, I thought about the cycle wheel. And it came to me that probably this is an image I will offer you from my perspective to understand the way Madhav worked. So you have the cycle wheel, you have the hub, the rim and the spokes. So Madhav was certainly the hub. And around him, if you just imagine concentric circles around the hub, was this vast universe of friends and colleagues that he had. So you have the inner circle and the outer circle. So people like Ram Guha were very close to the hub at the center, and I would place myself respectfully somewhere mid-distance. But then the cycle wheel, as I mentioned, and as you all know, have these spokes. These are these firm lines that connect from the hub to the rim. Madhav, he never, at least from my perspective, I don't think he rearranged his circles of friends. But then, through a phone call or a letter or an idea, he had this very rare gift of drawing someone inward into the inner circle. And sometimes it was through encouragement, sometimes through challenge. So when the moment passed, what happened? You would return to your place. You were not absorbed into the center, but you were certainly altered by the encounter that you had. And I certainly remain very grateful for the few encounters that I was able to make with him. So I will first talk about Madhav and me. So the first moment of this call, or the process of coming closer to the hub, that was in 1987. And this was at a workshop in Bangalore, organized by our dear late friend Paul Kurian. I I guess some of you in this audience may have known him. His brother Siddharth is here. And it was Paul Kurian who invited me to come to Bangalore for this conference. And it was on that occasion that I also got my first introduction to this very formidable trinity: Madhav Gadgil, Juan Martinez Allier, and Ramchandra Guha. I was then a rather reluctant academic working on political ecology issues in fisheries. And I dared to make a presentation on energetics in fishery and its impact on the marine commons. And to my surprise and my pride, it struck a chord with Madhav and with Yuan. And they were generously encouraging of my paper. Of course, it never got published. It was that workshop, I also think, that really seeded this collaboration between Ram Guha, Madhav, and Martinez Allier, right? And I think that was very important. And I'm fortunate that I was at that event, because that workshop and this collaboration, it shaped the Indian environmental thought in a very fundamental way. And it resulted also in some of the most influential writings on in environmentalism. My connection then deepened a little more. In 1989, Madhav was a member of the Prime Minister's, Rajiv Gandhi's, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's Science Advisory Council. And he invited me to a deliberation in Bangalore. Of course, I was quite surprised to get this letter from him. And it was there that I learned that his own PhD work was on fish population dynamics, and also that he had such close ties with fishing communities, which I also had in my work in Kerala. And so we got talking, and I was very pleasantly surprised that he shared a conviction. We had this common conviction that certain practices that were taking place in the fishery, for example, bottom trawling, was wrong. And the important thing was that what I thought, because of my activist background and understanding and discussion with the fishers and reading up things, I thought my view was very special. But I was very happy to know that Madhav thought so. And this was that bottom trawling is wrong, but it is not to be critiqued only on the grounds of social equity, but also because here is a technology which is devised it is designed for a temperate ecosystem. And when you transfer that to a tropical ecosystem, then it creates real ecological harm. And this is regardless of whether the trawler is owned by a fisherman or by a capitalist. So that was and I remember, talking quite a bit to him on this issue. So in 1984, another unexpected call from the hub, and Madhav wrote to me saying, please come with me to Geneva. Well, when Madhav called, I didn't get into too many details about what all this was about, but I certainly wanted to go, and it was just him and me. We went to Geneva, and on reaching there, I realized that he expected me to take on a very major role in steering a sort of a group task on economic, ecological resilience issues. And it soon became clear to me that his expectations of my competence were far greater than what I could meet. And I have always regretted disappointing him on that occasion. And I told him later that this failure was only a reflection of my limitation and not any lack of willingness. Of course, in his characteristic way, he just waved it aside. But that journey was a gift because I got to saw the kind of respect that he commanded among some of the world's leading environmental scientists. And being in Geneva for, I don't remember, it must have been 2 or 3 days, we also got the possibility to talk about our personal preoccupations and concerns and the stories that he told me, which are very gracefully told again in his autobiography. He strongly believed in grassroots governance, and in 1986, he asked me to contribute to an issue of the journal called Seminar on this topic of grassroots governance. And I wrote about creating a network of marine biomass councils, starting at the coastal panchayat. And this was an idea that flowed directly from, all the conversations that we had had. But then between 2000 and 2012, my contacts with Madhav reduced since I was out of the country often for long assignments. And however, I distinctly remember once spotting him at an airport and being so overjoyed, and went up to him and he said, "Oh," and realized that both he and I had a lot of time to wait for the next flight. So there we were. And I was involved in Indonesia at that time, in post-tsunami rehabilitation work in the province of Aceh. And I was dealing with a 400-year-old customary institution in fisheries. And this was my first time doing something like that. I worked and organized cooperatives and things like this, but working with a customary institution where nothing is written down was first time for me, and for something which had lasted for 400 years. So, I was so excited to see him, and we got talking about this. And again, I think this came back to the theme of grassroots governance, which we had discussed earlier, and also the role that customary institutions can play in environmental restoration. This was something which I figured it needed to be done, but I didn't know how to go about it. And that discussion in the airport made a big difference in the way I negotiated my work in Indonesia. So years later, in 2020, another message via the Spoke reached me, this time digitally. I had sent him an article I had written, and this was titled, "In a Post-COVID World, Lessons in Living Must Come from the Ocean," was the title of that article. I think it was published in Scroll. He read it and he gave me a brief commendation, and he attached a note, rather cryptic note, on a crony capitalist in our country. And below it was another cryptic line, which then became sort of a mandate for me. And he said, "People like you should lead a struggle along with the fishing community against the port coming up in Vizhinjam in Kerala." So this was the motivation I needed to help produce a people's report on the ecological and socio-economic impacts of that port, which was being constructed by the capitalist mentioned in that note which he wrote. And it was Ram Guha who very graciously released that report in Trivandrum in 2023. And then finally, last year, Onam, September 2025, I got just a simple WhatsApp message, scripted in Malayalam, Ona Ashamsagal, Onam greetings. So that was the warm final touch from the hub, a reminder of this connection that endured. Now let me say something about Madhav and Kerala. If these were the ways that Madhav reached individuals, Kerala showed how he could engage with an entire society. Kerala was the entire rim of that cycle wheel. And it was not a perfect circle. There were bumps and so on. So that was his relationship with Kerala. So his relationship with Kerala, as probably with Maharashtra, tells the story of his life philosophy. His contacts with Kerala began in the early 1970s, and I believe this was at a request of the ISRO for an environmental impact assessment. But his deeper engagement started with the struggle to save Silent Valley in the late 1970s. In 1979, the Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad, or the Kerala Science Movement as we call it in English, KSSP, was spearheaded by a very remarkable biology teacher called M.K. Prasad, whom we call Prasad Mash. Mash is word for teacher. They had made an alternative environmental impact assessment of the Silent Valley project. And I think this captured Madhav's imagination. And also the Parishad's mass-based environmental work, its austere lifestyles, and its innovative forms of collective action very deeply resonated with Madhav's understanding of science as a social practice. And the KSSP's slogan, Science for Social Revolution, was a language Madhav already spoke. His participation in the KSSP's 1980 People's Science Parliament, I think, cemented very much his faith in people's power, which he always had, but this was, I understand, a very important turning point. And that faith was vindicated when the expert panel in 1982, which was chaired by Professor M.G.K. Menon, on which Madhav was a member, presented its report to the Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi. And it was, stalwarts like Satish Chandran Nair and others who were also associated with him when he walked through Silent Valley. And this was really a historic triumph. Perhaps the first large development venture, these dams which were supposed to come up, the temples of India, a venture like this being halted purely for ecological reasons. And then Silent Valley became a national park. But Madhav continued to draw inspiration from Kerala's experiments in decentralization, working closely with the KSSP figures such as MP Parameshwaran, V.K. Damodaran, and others. And in 1994, there was a workshop at the Integrated Rural Training Center in Thrissur, and that played a very key role in shaping his the Western Ghats Biodiversity Network. This I happened to read in his book. And the core message that he tirelessly championed was, you cannot protect nature without the people rooted in it. I think all this set the stage for Madhav's most difficult engagement with Kerala through this Western Ghats ecology expert panel. The Kerala of 1910 was certainly not the Kerala of 1980, which he knew. The stakes had risen sharply, with land resources and development now bound to powerful commercial and religious interests. Political positions had hardened, public debate had grown more polarized, and the space for nuance had narrowed, turning disagreements into high intensity ecological battles and other issues. So the Gadgil Committee report, as it then was soon called, it was very measured and scientific. He traveled through Kerala with his co-panelist V.S. Vijayan, and they did not call for a shutdown of the Ghats, but rather for thoughtful, graded regulation with real power devolved to local communities. They asked Kerala to slow down and to think. But Kerala responded instead with rage. The report was vilified, its recommendations were distorted, and Madhav himself was personally attacked. He was branded anti-development, anti-people. The very idea of people science that he championed seemed to be rejected. And yet, in his passing, I came to see his true legacy in Kerala. On the 9th of January, I scanned all the Malayalam newspapers in Kozhikode, representing different communities, classes, religions, and ideological persuasions. Except one newspaper, all the others carried front page announcements, editorials, articles, photographs, caricatures of Madhav. I just translate a few of the headlines, front page headlines. The guardian of the Sahyadri is no more. The scientist who stood for nature and spoke for truth. The prophetic voice of the Western Ghats. Protector of the environment. The shade tree which was rooted in society. A mountain of thanks. And a pun on his word, Guard Hill. So, which state in India would give such endearing sentiments, and express this at the passing of a scientist? And here lies a profound truth. Many scientists are celebrated, even in newspapers. But to become a household word, a household name, as Madhav Gadgil undoubtedly did in Kerala, you have to be vigorously argued with, not only celebrated. You must be debated with in homes, in village assemblies, in schools, mosques, temple grounds, churches, legislative assemblies. This was where Kerala society debated and argued with Madhav. And that is why you talk to any school child in Kerala, he or she has heard of Gadgil. Yesterday I spoke to some people in Bangalore, very close to where he did much of his work. They had not heard of him. He moved from being a celebrated expert to a societal touchstone, a voice you agreed with or fought against, but you could never ignore. So if India carries an environmental conscience, it is because voices like Madhav Gadgil once spoke. We listened, we debated, we carried the argument home. In Kerala, the majority did not agree with him. But following the tumultuous landslides of 2018 and 2024, we soon realized that this was indeed a Himalayan blunder. And I realized that his style of engagement was not confined to one place or one kind of audience. You heard about scuba diving. Scuba dived with fishers in Panama. He trekked with tribal communities in the Western Ghats. He debated in academic halls with scientists and civil society activists. He moved easily across worlds. He was, in the fullest sense, a people's planetary scientist. His life partner, Sulochana, went ahead of him, and I like to imagine that he paused only long enough to tidy his desk before following her. We all have stardust in us. We are all part of creation. In time, we all go back to where we came. But Madhav was a meteor, blazing across our sky, leaving behind a trail of light, heat, and some necessary friction. Thank you.
It's been for me an extraordinarily enthroning and invigorating experience to listen to all of them. So please give them all a hand. Each one of them has brought so much to deepen our understanding of this extraordinary figure. I knew Madhav in this room, apart from his children. I think I knew him longer than anyone else. A couple of people, Professor Sarchandra and Professor Vidyanand, may have also been in that small category of people in this room. I wrote 2 books with him, many scholarly essays. I traveled with him all over. But I have learned so much, from listening to these extraordinary presentations by 5 individuals who really, in many ways, in different ways, but equally compelling and credible ways, embody the kind of legacy that Madhav Gadgil has left behind. So, what is there left for me to say? Maybe a few stories. Several people have begun with their first memory of Madhav. I first met him in the year 1982. I was then beginning a PhD in Calcutta, which was started out as a study of the Chipko movement, but ended somewhere else. And my father was a scientist at the Forest Research Institute. And I had come home in the summer break, and Madhav had come to give a talk. And one of my father's colleagues, whom I should remember now, who's no longer here, another scientist at the FRI, Dr. P.K. Sen Sharma, who had brought Madhav, took me to his talk, which was on the social behavior of elephants in Bandipur. And can elephants be altruistic beyond their shared genetic, beyond their family? And then he told Madhav that my colleague Dr. Guha's son is just beginning a PhD, which has something to do with environment Chipko. You must meet him. So our first meeting was in the red brick guest house at the FRI in 1982, and our last meeting was in Pune last year. A couple of speakers have mentioned the 2 books we wrote together. Now, I want to say a few things about those books. All the original ideas are his. I mean, what Nagesh kindly calls the Gadgil-Guha thesis and the other Gadgil-Guha thesis, the original ideas are his. I provided some of the empirical work. I cleaned up the prose, since my business is writing. But the original ideas are his. But it was an amazing process of collaboration. And one of the, to me, most revealing aspects of that collaboration was what a democratic person he was. Indian intellectual culture is incredibly hierarchical. And there are scientists in this room who know hierarchical Indian sciences. Take it from me that Indian social science is much more hierarchical. And among the different kinds of Indian social scientists, the most feudal and the most hierarchical are the Marxists. And among the Marxists, it is the Calcutta Marxists. And I was doing a PhD in Calcutta, where it is all you can't challenge or criticize anyone who is even 1 day older than you. And it's from there that I come to work with Madhav. And we are arguing and debating. And, he would listen, he would argue back. John talked about his arguments with the people of Kerala, and sometimes he would change his mind. I mean, at one stage while we were writing this Fisher Land, he was very enchanted with a certain book that his old teacher, E.O. Wilson, had written, called Sociobiology, which in retrospect, I think everyone will recognize is not one of Wilson's better books. But he was enchanted with those ideas, and I hammered them out of him. And I think this Fisher Land is a much better book as a result. So this was the so the ideas were his. Sometimes I got him to modify it a bit. The field work was all his. So all the examples from the field were his. A fair amount of the examples from the archives, all the examples from the archive were mine. And as I said, I rewrote some of the prose. I mean, we sat together. But it was to collaborate with someone of such, neither of us could have written those books alone. Possibly Madhav could have written with someone else, with his ideas, someone else. I couldn't have, because I said the creative original ideas. The argument of this fisher land, which is now recognized to be the first ecological history of India, written by two people, neither of whom were historians, which tells you something about the Indian academic life and its disciplinary boundaries. So it was undergirded by this dialectic between what Madhav called prudence and profligacy. So when are human beings, individually and socially, prudent, responsible in their use of nature? When are they profligate? And that was his, and it was actually, interestingly, an idea that comes from his understanding of scientific ecology, what Uma talked about. But the ideas were his. The second, the category that Nagesh mentioned, these threefold ecosystem people, ecological refugees, omnivores. Omnivores was absolutely a brilliant idea. And after our book came out, I happened to be in Germany. And one of my friends, who was a very interesting thinker on ecology and development, called Wolfgang Sachs, he read our book at this category of omnivores. Back in 1995, he said, Ram, Karl Marx's slogan was, workers of the world unite. But in late 20th century globe, it is omnivores of the world unite. And that's what we have all over the world. I mean, that's all we have. So, but those three concepts were his. I mean, I may have fleshed it out and I said cleaned up a little bit here and there. But this kind of experience of working with someone who was not 1 day, 1 week, 1 year, 5 years, but 60 years older than me, and yet was so open, so egalitarian, and I mean, that was just. Now, we had intellectual differences, which we were able to iron out amicably, and then these two books came out, and each of us would own whoever contributed what, each chapter in each section of these two books. But we also had, those differences were reconcilable and were reconciled. But we had temperamental differences that were really at odds. Madhav loved being in the field and didn't like writing. I detested being in the field and liked writing. Now, you need to actually do both. So I always complained to him that, you should really, at some stage, no one knew, as several of the speakers have pointed out, no one knew India better than him. The society, the ecology, the landscape, the history, the different categories of forests. I mean, he had worked on forests, pastoralism, fisheries. I mean, he'd been in every state in India, done field work in different parts. And usually, walking, cycling, in train. And he had all of this, and he could bring to this unparalleled field experience, his scientific training, his social scientific instincts, which are partly genetic, because his father was a great economist, but it was more than that. So I would tell him, Madhav, come on. Someone would say, one of his students, I didn't even know the name, I forget, was working on sacred, or maybe one of Kailash Malhotra's students, was working on sacred groves in Churchandpur, which is now the cookie territory. He said, no, I have to go. I have not seen sacred groves. I have seen sacred groves in Karnataka and Kerala and Maharashtra, but in the Northeast I want to see it. So this was in the late 50s. And I said, no, you have to write your book. He said, no. So he complained that I needed to season, get some first-hand experience of how Indians lived, labored, and interacted with nature. Now, I was an indifferent field worker, which is why I turned from sociology to history. Sociologists to field work, historians work in the archives. And one of the great advantage of interrogating documents rather than doing field work with people is that documents don't answer back. So, but yet, of course, I did do some field work. So I made some trips with him, and I'll recount maybe just three, short trips. I mean, I never did the kind of difficult immersive fieldwork that he did. The first was, Nagesh, to yours and his beloved Western Ghats. Now again, this is the date is important. It was June 1992, the week of the first Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. Now, Madhav must have got, at a conservative estimate, 15 invitations from 15 different groups to represent them at that summit. Business class, etc., etc. But he chose that week to go to the Western Ghats and to take his young collaborator with him. And we took a train. I mean, it's like, it's now 33 years ago, that train journey. It was one of the old lines built by the Mysore, when Mysore was still a princely state, from, I forget, maybe Yashwantpur it started, to Talagoppa, on the crest of the Ghats. And if you go on that route, it's a tiny train, and I hope it still exists. And every small railway platform has our rain tree, because they were planted by Königsberg and so on. And of course, he would just talk about various things, about his studies and what he learned. And then we got to the crest of the Ghats, and then you go down the spectacular slope and all the rivers. And he would tell me all about the rivers and where they came from. Then we ended up in Kumta, which was on the estuary, where his student MD Subhash Chandra taught. And we stayed with Subhash, and where Subhash was nervous because he heard I was vegetarian. And the estuarine fish is, particularly valuable. And I said, I'm not a moral vegetarian, I'm merely a aesthetic vegetarian. So, of course, we sat and ate the fish. So we looked at that coastal ecosystem. Then we went to Masur, where he was, that island in the river where he worked. And then we climbed up the Ghat again to Sirsi, where we met K.M. Hegde and Dr. Principal L.T. Sharma, who was one of the organizers of that seminar on. And then from there we went inland through Mandla to Dharwad, where SRB Ahmed was hosting something, and back. And so it's like a week or 10 days with this, with him talking and me mostly listening. And many of you who know me, that's not a normal experience for me. Right. And I think the kind of things he told me, I remember one thing he told me about where weeds came from. So there were two weeds. One is lantana, and the other is pasupalam, that Congress grass, what they used to call Congress grass. And he told me how they came to Karnataka. Apparently, pasupalam, what is it called? Parthenium. Apparently, Congress grass. Apparently, Parthenium came on the backs of migrants from Burma, fleeing the Japanese in 42, 43. So he would have, and lantana, of course, is well known. So he would brought as an ornamental plant and then took by the British and took over. So this is the kind of, that was the first field trip where I was, listening. And of course, when we got to Malnad and from there towards the arid parts of Bombay, Karnataka, he would tell me stories about pastoralists, including pastoralists who kept not goat and sheep, but duck, and traveled with duck to from one village to another. So it was just an immersive course in ecology and society from this master. That was the first trip I made. The second trip, I said, I'm just sharing a few experiences with you, was must have been 96 or 97. Ecology and Equity came out in 1995. The Malayalam edition was published 2-3 years later. At that stage, I had not been to Kerala. I had been to many other states in India, but that was my first trip to Kerala with Madhav, traveling by train. And it was the Malayalam release of Ecology and Equity. Book was published by the Kerala Sastra Sahitya Parishad. And the person John mentioned, Professor M.K. Prasad, whom I would say one of the few people Madhav venerated. There were quite a few people Madhav recognized as intellectual equals. But one of the few people, Shivarab Karat was one person he venerated, Chandi Prasad Bhatt was another, and M.K. Prasad was the third. And so Professor Prasad came to receive us. And that was my first culture shock in Kerala. Vice Chancellor of a university coming in a bush shirt and rubber chappals. Okay, and we got on the train and I was introduced to Professor Prasad. And Professor Prasad said, Madam, I'm very sorry. Madhav, and he didn't know, call me Ram in those days. Later on, he became a friend too. He said, I'm very sorry. You see, our release of your book is today, but the attendance will be affected. There is a bus strike. So Madhav put his arm around Prasad's shoulder. As Prasad, he said, Prasad, don't worry. I've been coming to Kerala for 20 years. This will be my 15th trip. I've been to different parts of India, and on no trip have I come when there's not been some strike or another. Right. Now, that was field experience number 2. Field experience number 3 was more serious. This was, I think, in about the year 2009 or 10, or maybe even 9, 10, 11. Madhav was getting close to 70. He'd retired from IISc. He had gone back to Pune. And he was very active in trying to really stop extractive and mining in Goa. And instead of mining by crony capitalists who paid off politicians, he was trying to promote cooperative mining. And he said, Ram, you have to come. I know you don't like fieldwork, but I have to show you this experiment in cooperative mining. So, which was somewhere in the south of Goa. And there was a very idealistic young man, a Goan, who was trying to organize the villagers there was a kind of a iron mine, which so cooperatively you can, which means going as an illustration of the inverse thesis that Nagesh talked about. If a local, Madhav Gadgil was not against development. That is a pernicious lie spread by the iron triangle of netas, babus and contractors. He said, look, if the local community is involved as stakeholders, perhaps, getting a share of the profits, perhaps even if they are organized enough, as in Goa, and educated enough doing it themselves, they will firstly care about the externality so that it'll have minimal environmental negative effects. So that's where we went to Goa to study this. And on that visit, he took me to the village where there was this young man who had been actually attacked by the goons of the mining contractors. I don't know what happened to him after that. But then we went to the home of the dedicatee of A Walk Up the Hill, Father Bismarck, who had been murdered by the mining mafia. And the book is dedicated to him. It's a beautiful long dedication. And I believe the book is on sale outside, and you must get it if those of you don't have it. So that was kind of my last field experience. Now, I think he was able to prevail on me a little bit, so I made a few field trips, some not in his company. I spent 2 intense weeks in Bastar with the remarkable, courageous anthropologist Nandini Sundar, looking at the civil war there. I was also able to persuade him, especially after he went back to Pune, to do a little less field work and write that wonderful book, A Walk Up the Hill. And the book was released at the Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics. And I said, please come here, we'll do it here. And by then, he was not in the best of health, and it was not easy for him to travel, and he would have hated taking a wheelchair. I know the kind of person he was. There's no way he was, unlike many people who don't need wheelchairs but yet ask for it. So it was in Pune. And at that book had been translated into 8 languages. And simultaneously, and I thought I'm going to help him, release the English edition of the book. And the 8 translators were there, and they were all honored. Okay, now I will end. There's so much I could share with you, memories of his remarkable wife, I think, who's an amazing scientist in her own right, and with a delightful sense of humor too. But I'll end with 2 intellectual lessons, not intellectual lessons, 2 lessons. He taught me many intellectual lessons. 2 lessons on the morality of intellectual practice that he taught me. So one relates to the anti-Kaiga movement, which Nagesh was very involved in, which is the movement to stop the nuclear plant in Kaiga in the Western, ultimately unsuccessful movement, the movement led by Shivaram Karant, where he was participated. So there was a signature campaign. And so one of the organization was called CANE. We used to all meet weekly at Gandhi Peace Foundation. And someone said, you must get Professor Gadgil to sign. So I took it to him and he said, look, I am a scientist who has worked on ecology. I can sign a petition on community forest rights. I can sign a petition on proper compensation to peasants who suffer crop damage from elephants. I can sign a but I am not a physicist. I'm in an institute where there are people who know a great deal more physics than me. When I engage in public, uh, reach out and take a stand on a public issue, I must have the credibility of knowing something about it. Now, today you will find some social scientists and so-called activists who will sign every petition. You'll be professor, and they lend their name, Professor so-and-so. So I am very clear. There are three things I know something about, and I will sign a petition about. One is obviously forests and biodiversity, which I've worked with Madhav and others. The other is freedom of expression, because I'm a writer. I mean, you persecute writers and academics, I will stand up for them. And the third is Hindu-Muslim harmony, because I'm a biographer of Mahatma Gandhi, nothing else. So I think this is one lesson. The other lesson is actually more important. In the years when I was in Calcutta, one of the things I imbibed from my Marxist teachers was a knee-jerk anti-Americanism. But then my wife Sujata and I were living in Calcutta, and she got a scholarship to study graphic design at Yale. And of course, I was not going to stand in her way, but I was not going to be separated for 2 years either. So somehow I found a way to join her and to get a lecturer's job in the same university. And, after that I came back and joined the newly formed Center for Ecological Sciences on their faculty in 1987. So I joined, I think, in July 1987. And possibly in September or something, I got an invitation to a conference in New York. I said, I can go back. I can meet these wonderful friends I made at Yale. I can go to Stand Bookshop. I can do a week's research in the New York Public Library. So I went to Madhav, who was technically my boss. And it was Sarkari office. He had to sign off leave papers. He said, look, Ram, I will give you permission. No problem. I don't stand with it. But just think. You've just spent 18 months in America. You imbibed the intellectual resources of a great university. Now, I know, like me, by the way, this Harvard business. Now, but I tweeted something about Madhav and his passing and all that. One of the comments was, I very rarely read the comments, one of the comments was, a unique combination of Harvard and hard work. Now, interestingly though, Madhav, I mean, there was always that Maharashtrian, Ghati in him. So he pronounced Harvard, possibly even when he was in Cambridge, as Harvard. That was the kind of organic man he was. So he said, you got all this. Why do you want to go back? I said, no, he said, look, you're young. You're articulate. You speak the language of international discourse, English very well. You're St. Stephen's Doon School, etc. You're working on a fashionable subject, environmentalism. You're working on even more fashionable subject, third world environmentalism. If you accept this invitation, you'll meet people there, and 3 more invitations will follow. You'll attend 3 conferences, and 9 more will follow. And then you'll never have written 10 years later, you'll realize you haven't written your second book. So it's very important to pick which conferences are worth your while intellectually. Now, I've heeded that lesson. I wish some of my younger colleagues, because this is the truth. You could just be swanning all around the world, if you're in these kinds of fields. I'll end, since Joan Martinez Allier was mentioned. I'll end with him. So Joan Martinez Allier, for those of you who don't know, is arguably the world's most influential ecological economist. He is even older than Madhav. He was born in 1938. He's as remarkable an individual as Madhav. He was born in Franco, Spain. So he went into exile, lived and worked abroad, and went back after Spain became a democracy. And among his he's written some really landmark works. But those of you who are interested in ecology and economics, and this is an economist who writes everyday prose, not technical arcane language. and there are no equations. There's some graphs and tables, but no equations. 3 landmark books he's written. One is called Ecological Economics, which is a history of those dissenting economists who understood the importance of energy and resources in tracking the, how an economy functions. The second is called The Environmentalism of the Poor, which draws on case studies from Latin America, Africa, India. And the third, which came out last year, is called Land, Water, Air, Freedom. It's again about environmental justice. So the first book came out in 1987, Ecological Economics. And the late Paul Kurian, who was a wonderful person we all missed, who had read it on one of his travels overseas. And he came back and he told me, Ram, we have to get this brilliant Spanish economist who works on ecology here. And his brother Siddhartha, who's here, was able to organize the conference. And then, of course, he came, he got to know Madhav, and then India became a very important part of his work. So I was not planning to do this, but I will nonetheless, since the name has come up. When Madhav died, for me, it was like losing an intellectual parent. Now, Juan is the closest foreign friend I've had. We've also co-authored a book together. So I wrote to him and saying that, Madhav passed away. So this is what he wrote. I am so sorry. I met him in 1988 for the first time when Juan came to Bangalore, and a few other times later. Such an honest and learned person. It is a great loss to you. I read his memoirs in detail, including his travel in Rajasthan to help fight infestation by rats of the fields of a tribal group, followed by a banquet of rats as he described it. He trained himself. This is very important because he trained himself. Uma has mentioned where he's coming from, mathematical ecology in Harvard and citation classics. He trained himself to help and work for the people of India and the environment, in particular in the Western Ghats. He would ask you to keep on and be strong. So that's the message for all of us. He would ask us to keep on and be strong. Thank you very much.